how lucky we may be in this country and in the country I'm from, for instance, that we're even within this discussion and freely able to have it and so on, and that some things down the road might stop that being the case. You know, the country that is most striking in is Ireland. I first went to Ireland, I did my first book in the late 90s, 2000. And then Ireland was still a very, very, I mean, it's the most oppressively religious country in Europe I'd been to. The Catholic Church had such a grip. Today, I don't think you could find a more secular country. It's really fascinating, and it's one thing in particular, which is a clerical abuse scandal, which has just turned the Irish people, understandably, against the whole thing. And, you know, to the extent that a bishop now stands up and makes a moral pronouncement, and the Irish public want to do the opposite. You know, in fact, the Catholic Church, I can't remember what was in the abortion debate or the gay marriage. Yes, they sat out the gay marriage debate, basically, because they knew that if they came out against, the public vote in the referendum would be even bigger for gay marriage.
And the scandals, they go deep there. They're not just dealing with pederasts and child rapists. This was theft of children from unwed mothers and workhouses and just...
and in living memory.
Yeah.
No, it's an extraordinary thing, but to see a society shift that fast in 18 years or so is a remarkable thing.
Which kind of sticks a pin in what everybody who knows me knows I've been waiting to object to. If the fear is we're losing something, so as a stopgap measure, go back to what got you here. I might have a slight issue with going back to what got us here if the place we are is that we're bleeding and bloody on the ground after the fall. But one of the things that the secular community in the United States has been doing, for the longest time, atheism in the United States was a bunch of guys that looked like me complaining about how much religion sucked and congratulating themselves for, getting the right answer to what I think is literally the easiest question: do I have enough reason to believe this? But as we move forward, and the percentage of the population that identify as nones, the NONEs, no religious preference and no religious identity, we've started to do things like, well, actually Sunday Assembly, I think, started in Britain, but it's here as well, and Oasis, and we're building landing places that are founded on principles of secular humanism, which can serve as one potential moral and virtue guiding principle, but also create places for people to land when they find their way out of religion.
Sure.
And I'm happy to tell people, I go to church not for the reasons that you're suggesting, but I go to church more often than people would guess, because on the TV show, I want to make sure that I am not straw-manning religious views.
Do you ever get surprised when you do that?
Not anymore.
No.
There's been a massive change from when I was younger. I mean, I went to a Southern Baptist church primarily. I would occasionally go to Pentecostal churches because they had better concerts. And they would have the Christian rock bands of Petra and Carmen and stuff, and they'd all come to those churches. So I liked those.
The very words Christian rock band just make me kind of come goose pimply.
I feel the same way when I hear Christian magician, but that's another story. But growing up in those kinds of churches, I want to make sure that I'm not only relying on the version of Christianity that I grew up with, and that I'm not relying on something from 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So I will go to some of the churches. The mega churches, even most of the people I grew up with who were religious would look at most of the modern mega churches and say, well, that's not Christianity.
Right.
Now, I don't get to say what is or isn't Christianity. That's for them to decide. But it is very much, you don't get dressed up in your Sunday best anymore. You go in jeans and a t-shirt, and you're singing rock songs that have been perhaps mildly converted to be a little bit more about a God. That some atheist on LSD wrote this song for the secular world, and the church has managed to co-opt it. And they've co-opted the slogans from everything. You'll have T-shirts of the McDonald's shirts, and they'll twist the McDonald's logo to be about Jesus and all this stuff.
How do they do that?
It is.
What?
So Seth Andrews, everybody loves Seth? Yes. He hosts the Thinking Atheist podcast. He has a video up specifically going through the various things that Christian organizations steal. They twist it around.
How do they get Jesus out of McDonald's?
Does anybody remember the specific one from McDonald's? I don't know, but there was
Wow.
They take Mountain Dew logos, everything, and just turn it into this. It is very much a marketing thing, and I don't want to ever say that somebody's being disingenuous about their beliefs.
Sure.
But when we talk about, hey, maybe we've lost something, I don't think that I could ever send people to church for that reason, and it may just be a difference in the type of church that we're talking about.
Yeah, it may be. I mean, as I said, I don't want to overemphasize it, but I mean, there are tiny, tiny pockets where what I'm saying is not the case. The island in the Outer Hebrides that my father comes from, there are about 30 different sects of Presbyterianism, within about square mile of each other, and they're a bit watered down, but not that much. But otherwise, you, as I say, it's fascinating to me because I've been doing this for 20 years or so, and I've just noticed that the entire discussion on ethics, for instance, if you go to the BBC or something and you have a discussion on ethics, 15 years ago, you'd always have a bishop, purple robe, big cross, and so on. And now they just don't go for those guys. And when they do, those guys don't have much to add, it seems. I mean, you can, regret or otherwise, I don't particularly, but you can see they just don't know how to find a way into the discussions we're now having.
And this is something I've actually been kind of standing in opposition to here, because you'll watch the news and there will be some member of the clergy on to comment on seemingly everything. I'm exaggerating slightly, but there'll be a political discussion and you'll have to get the minister's view of it. And it happens in the local communities as well as the national news. I remember a CNN brief piece, but it stuck in my mind forever because the banner behind them was, "Why do atheists inspire such hatred?" Of course, I immediately point out the question is flawed because it presumes that we're the ones inspiring this, rather than why is hatred directed at atheists? Because then it could be our fault or their fault or a combination. So asking the wrong questions is probably one of the biggest problems in the world right now. But they had a panel on to discuss it. How many atheists were on that panel? None.
Really?
Not one. 2 Christians and a Jew to explain to the world that atheists were just really bad at PR, and that we didn't have any morals to live by.
My sense is, by the way, and again, I mean this is a positive, my sense even in this country is that a lot of the religious leaders, they don't quite want to tell you what they really believe, which is a step in the right direction. And my impression still is that most of them know that the culture has shifted or is shifting significantly enough that they know that some of the things they might believe or might have claimed 20 years ago have become total landmines for them.
So here's what we'll do. You come down to Austin, we'll take a drive to San Antonio, and you can listen to John Hagee, who runs one of the biggest churches in the United States, talk about how nasty atheists are, and if they don't like God's country, they can get out of the United States, boy.
He must be about the only one who hasn't been caught with a rent boy. Haven't they all, almost all? And I notice and late friend Christopher Hitchens used to have a great riff on this, that whenever you saw any of them holding forth on moral issues, you just make a note, and before you knew it, you'd find they'd maxed out the credit card trying to pay some rent boy.
The scandals are
almost consistent rule.
So
I'm amazed Hagee. I don't know what the laws of defamation are like in this country, but I'm amazed Hagee is already not.
Yeah, well, and he's just one of many examples. There's some that are, and this is another problem with the internet. There's a pastor, I'm not even going to bother saying his name because he's already gotten too much publicity. Tiny, tiny church, and yet broadcasts over the internet, which gets him all kind of attention, mostly from atheists who want to just say, "Oh my gosh, this guy is terrible." I don't know what percentage of church-going Christians actually care what this guy says, but he's awful with regard to women and everything else. But when clearly there's going to be differences. I wonder if how much of the differences that we're seeing are actually related to differences in culture. Because I have some rather troubling questions related to culture. And as you've spoken a lot about issues related to multiculturalism, I figured maybe we could address some of that, because what does it mean to say British culture, Western culture? Is there even enough uniformity of value for that to be a meaningful phrase? And what is it that we should be worried about losing if that's diluted?
Yeah, that's a huge one. We're all trying to think about this at the moment. And there are versions of it that sound nicer than others. Some are horrific. We have this big discussion now, what is our culture, what is Britishness, and every country in Europe is having that discussion, and I hear it here, I hear it in Canada, sort of constant self-examination. There's nothing wrong with that in a way, although it can cause what I regard as being a kind of breakdown. I mean, if you said to any individual all the time, who are you, what are you, you'd end up on the couch quite fast. And I think it might be the same for societies. If you just keep asking what you are rather than just getting on with it, you can kind of instigate an increased nervousness.
I think my instinct is to not care.
Right.
I'm happy to adopt whatever labels apply to me and to explain what those labels are, but there's nothing about me. This actually bothered my wife a little bit when I said so, because she cares a lot more about her heritage and her history and the people from the Appalachian Mountain or the Smoky Mountains and things like that, and what those people have gone through. And I don't want to be just dismissive of history, but one of my ancestors was the preacher who was the founder of one of the first 3 Baptist churches that became the Southern Baptist Convention. And apart from it being novel, I don't care about that.
Right.
But there are also people in my past and cultural ties I could make that I would be that I don't view as negatives.
Right.
But they're not me.
No, but there's another French philosopher, Alain Finkielkraut, who recently said in an interview something I was very struck by. He said, we in France used to think that what we had was worth taking around and giving to the rest of the world. And then we retreated from that idea, and he said, now we're in a position of thinking, can we at least still have it for ourselves? And I was struck by that because, again, it might be a thing of, depending where you are and what you've seen, but given some of the things that France has gone through in recent years, some of which I write about in the book, multiple really terrible terrorist attacks and assassinations and so on, I can see why they are getting nervous and wanting to address some very fundamental principles. Is what we have in the secular French state, which allows for religion, but now is dealing with new problems, is it all vulnerable? And I know a lot of people who feel it is. And I suppose another thing, I spend a lot of my life as a journalist traveling, not just across this country and North America and across all of Europe, but the Middle East, the Far East, and Africa, and so on. And there is a definite feeling you get in certain places of, I don't want to force my own view of my own society on this, but this is very different, and it reminds you, therefore, that what you have is unusual. And I suppose that at different times, people become more aware of how, gotta be careful how you say this, but how lucky we may be in this country and in the country I'm from, for instance, that we're even within this discussion and freely able to have it and so on, and that some things down the road might stop that being the case.